haven't talked a lot about the prequel cover art, mainly because I don't find a lot of those covers very artistically interesting. But with the Dark Nest trilogy, we saw the return of Cliff Nielsen, who had previously created the cover art for the Jedi Apprentice series, as well as the hardcover New Jedi Order releases. And his hardcover NJO covers especially featured tons of different elements and hidden layers. His covers for the Dark Nest trilogy, though, are much simpler, perhaps because these were paperbacks and there's not as much room to work in. Each novel highlights a different member of the original trio and also contains a lot of large, beetle-y looking bugs. As with the previous two books, I remembered there were bugs. Yuck. I'm also surprised here because a number of things that I expected to happen in the previous two books, like Jag being shot down, actually didn't occur until book number 3. So, a brief summary. Luke Skywalker has summoned the Jedi back to Ossus, but even the combined might of the Jedi Order might not be enough to stop this Chiss-Killik border confrontation from breaking out into galaxy-wide war. Both Luke and Leia will put their Jedi skills to the test as they face off against the Dark Nest. So as the Swarm War opens, we are sometime into this Chiss-Killik conflict. As the prologue opens, the young Jedi Knights like Jaina and Lobaka and Zekk and Jacen are helping the Asai Killik against a Chiss offensive. And they've been feeling this pull on the part of their uncle for them all to come back to Ossus, but Jaina and Zekk don't want to abandon the Killiks. And at the same time, the Chiss seem to have some sort of insecticide missile that they shoot off and then they destroy, and they don't want the Jedi and the Killik to even get their hands on it. So Luke decides that the only way to get the Jedi Order together again is to, I suppose, give them an ultimatum and put them in such a position that they have to accept Luke's leadership. This didn't feel like a particularly new solution, though. I feel like in the past, the Jedi have been very contentious, and then Luke takes control of them, and then once everything's resolved, he's like, I don't want to be the only one in charge here, we need to get systems in place, and then this all happens again. So he's the Grand Master now, but this doesn't seem like a long-term solution to me. And I think even Luke accepts that because he's like, I want to have a strong second in command in place, and he seems to be eyeing up Jacen for that role. But anyway, I'll get to that later. Jedi, still very dysfunctional. So basically, we have these subplots where Han and Leia are trying to figure out where Jaina is. They, yes, run into the squibs again. Luke comes up with a plan to tackle the Dark Nest problem, which needs the help of a bunch of different Jedi and also the Galactic Alliance military. We finally get the end of that R2-D2 subplot wherein he's got these hidden memories from the prequels, and finally Luke and family, well, not really Leia, but Jacen at least for some of it, see the final conclusion of what happened to Padme. They face off against the Dark Nest. Mara and Jacen are very badly injured. Luke realizes to take out Lomi Plo and Raynar, he's gonna have to face them on his own and face his fears. And so the final battle has, like, everyone in the same place. We have Galactic Alliance troops, we have the Chiss, we have the Killiks, we have the Dark Nest, we have the Chiss trying to shoot this parasite that would destroy the Killik race, and Leia and Jaina and all of them are trying to stop it. Then Leia faces off against Alema, and Luke faces off against Raynar and Lomi, and everything's concluded. But the way that the epilogue ends, there are a lot of loose ends left hanging for the Legacy of the Force series to pick up on. Let's look at Luke first. In the first book, in The Joiner King, I said I really appreciated how Luke and Mara were parenting their son, for the most part, that they were bringing him along with him, letting him be a part of the adventure. Well, that definitely fell by the wayside in book 2, and especially in book 3. We don't see much of Ben at all. Luke and Mara confront Jacen about using the Force on his young cousin, and he admits it, but he has a story to explain it, and they accept this and are like, "You're such a good influence on Ben." And it's like, you as the reader are like, that's one way to interpret that. And Luke does not want to take full ownership of the Jedi Order, but he doesn't see any other way out of the situation that they're in right now, where people aren't listening to each other and the Jedi are not in accord. So he basically makes himself Grand Master. And at the end he says, "We're gonna have a council, we're gonna fix this." But it's a lot of responsibility for one person to hold. And if we learned anything from the Bantam era books, the pre-New Jedi Order books, it's that Luke's often away, off dealing with things, and I think having him be the sole head of the Jedi Order, I don't know how that'll work out. But again, we still have Legacy of the Force and the Fate of the Jedi to go, and I think that's one thing that they're going to be working through, that like this is not the way to fix the Jedi's problems, it's just a temporary stopgap. And in my opinion, it's not a very good one. I have to say, Jacen once again worrying us about that downward track he's on, in that he's one of the 3 people that see these seeds with Padme and Anakin from R2-D2's memory. And he's like, yeah, I could see why he did that. You know, he's trying to protect his family. And like, Luke and Mara don't see that as a warning sign at all. They're just like, that's one way to take it, Jacen, but I don't think that's correct. And Jacen's just like, Jacen worries me. I think Jacen's obviously supposed to worry me, but just the more I read, the more I was like, honey, oh, please don't, no. It does feel very much like he's already in the process of turning his sister against him just by being completely withdrawn from their link that they share, and also by essentially lying to her to get the young Jedi to attack the Chiss. And we also don't get direct confirmation in the text, and I'll get to this in the issues bit, but I also strongly suspect that Jacen is the leaking information to the Chiss about all this stuff, because he had that vision of war and he wants to prevent it. So I guess that's his motivations going forward. Preventing war. After having lived through the Yuuzhan invasion, he doesn't want anything like that to happen again, and also protecting his family and feeling really sympathetic towards Anakin, more so than a normal person would. With Jaina and Zekk, they're still linked. There's still no resolution of them as joiners, which, as someone who finds the concept of joiners really creepy, was very frustrating for me reading. That it almost seems at this point like the characters who were opposed to them being joiners have forgotten their initial opposition, and like no one is actively trying to fix this. This is just the way they are now. I felt too a little bit like Jaina and all the younger generation of Jedi were underused in this story, that in focusing so heavily on Luke and Leia, especially, that the next generation, who I would expect to be playing a larger role and taking on leadership, aren't here. So with Jaina and Zekk, they stay behind with the Killik. They are there through this really long attack on the Chiss part. And Jaina has always been an amazing starfighter pilot, but instead this book has the majority of the time she's stuck on the ground, and she's tried to temper what Raynar / Uduthal wants them to do with their actual strategy. And it's not until towards the end that we actually see her in an X-Wing. But I just felt like it wasn't played to her strengths to have her for these frankly boring ground battles. Doesn't let her character traits and her strengths come to the forefront in any way. Han and Leia take off to track down where their daughter is. They have these disguises that make them look like aliens. This is something that Troy Denning has done before, because in Tatooine Ghost, when Han and Leia secretly attend the auction, she's pretending to be a Twi'lek and he's pretending to be a Deveronian. And here, she's pretending to be a Thaleen, the same species that Prince Shizor is, and Han's pretending to be an Arcadian. And like, okay. So they deal with the squibs, and then they figure out that there's going to be these attacks on these planets, and then they go back, once again, trying to find where Jaina is, and they get captured by the Chiss. There was an entire chapter where Leia's being interrogated by a Chiss officer, and she can see on the screen in the next room is Han, and he's being tortured, and they, cut his entire ear off, and it's gory. It's really upsetting. And she escapes, and she runs into Han, and he's fine, and he sees the screen and was like, that guy looks just like me. And then we cut to, they're trying to make their way back to the Falcon. And number one, having to read, even if it wasn't really happening, Leia watched someone cut her husband's ear off. That's not cool. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. And then there's also a part of me that as soon as it's revealed to be a fake, I'm like, well, how was it fake? Anyway, Leia faces off against Alema and, wins, and when the book ends, she's a Jedi Knight now. Saba takes her lightsaber and says that she should make a new one. And the Chiss have this parasite weapon, and they want to wipe out all the Killiks, and that makes sense for them. And they very much strike me as the kind of people that would be like, we don't want to leave them a threat at all. If we can wipe them out completely, it's just safer for us as the Chiss. I guess, though, even as someone who hates bugs, completely exterminating them just seems like not the side we're supposed to be rooting for. And for the Killik, I feel bad for all the little Woolowoos. Woolowoos? The communication ones that followed Jaina around, because there's so many of them died. That's sad. Even if they are this size beetles, that's still sad. Raynar is defeated. Luke's able to knock him out, and the Jedi get him back, and I guess they're gonna rehabilitate him. And Alema is in worse shape than when she started. Each book, she's in worse shape than when she started. During her fight with Leia, Leia manages to cut off part of her foot, and then it looks like she's eaten by a spider sloth, but we didn't see the body, so she's probably gonna come back. And then Lomi Plo, all her strength is in her ability to deceive, to make herself unnoticeable, and when it actually comes down to a lightsaber fight, Luke has the upper hand on her pretty easily. So my first issue, a minor squibble, was that there were some made up Star Wars swear words in this book, but more so in the entire trilogy, that had really never appeared before, and every time they showed up I was like, what? That could just be me, who really thinks that the most perfect Star Wars swear word is cis-spit. You just have so many uses for it, it just sounds so good. So we have Han at one point being like, the poor Rodder, and I was like, Rodder? And at another point, actually more than once, we have Han or Leia being like, Bloa! And I looked it up. I guess that first appeared in Tatooine Ghost, so again, we have these Denning made-up Star Wars obscenities, but they just felt out of place to me. And I suppose they felt out of place because I'd never seen them before. My second issue was I felt like the climax was too short here. Basically, Luke facing off against Raynar and then Lomi is one chapter. And it's the last chapter before the epilogue. And sure, it's a longer chapter than a lot of the previous chapters, but it still felt like everything was resolved very quickly, and I would have preferred that it took a little more time here. And I think part of it too was having only Luke face off against Raynar and Lomi. I really wish that it had been a team effort, that maybe some people had taken Raynar while Luke and maybe others took on Lomi instead of just one man against all the odds. And Luke is very powerful, but just having only Luke take them down makes you wonder, why did no one take them down earlier, other than, I guess, Luke hadn't learned to face his fears yet. And this applies not just to the Swarm War, but to all three of books. But it did feel at times like Denning had an idea and then he was just digging through all these different elements to see what he could use with his idea. So it's like there's a border confrontation going on in the unknown regions against these insects and someone else. So it's the unknown regions. It has to be the Chiss. But with the end result that, like, Aristocrat Formby's appearance at the end of the Swarm War seemed very unlike him. Not just unlike his appearance in Survivor's Quest, but even unlike his appearance in the first book, in The Joiner King. Or we have, the Chiss are involved, so we have Jag here. But then just, like, simple continuity flubs. Like, at one point, Jag was described as having brown hair. He has black hair. And instead he had a scar through his eye, when it's more accurate to say that, like, his scar goes from his scalp down to his eyebrow. And then the commanding admiral of the Galactic Alliance for the Swarm War is Admiral Palayan, which definitely took me aback because last we saw of him in the Unifying Force, he was the supreme commander of the Imperial Remnant. And while it seemed like the Imperial Remnant and the Galactic Alliance were going to start speaking to each other, I had no idea that the Imperial Remnant was going to be swallowed up by the Galactic Alliance. My final issue was that there was a lot of obvious sequel bait for Legacy of the Force here, but at the same time, I also felt like there were some unresolved things that I don't expect to be answered in Legacy of the Force. So I would argue that Jacen's arc, Alema's fate, and also what's gonna happen to Jag are obviously left hanging for Legacy of the Force to pick up on. But it's just stuff like, how did the Chiss make Leia think that Han was being tortured when Han wasn't there? Or Ben had a connection to the Dark Nest, and what happened with that? What's gonna happen with that? Luke knows that there's a leaking information to the Chiss. He suspects that it's Cal Omos, but me as the reader is like, yeah, it's probably Jacen. But where the book ends, we don't get confirmation of any of that. But even things like, here we learn that Jag's family lost status because in releasing Lobaka, they put their own word that he wouldn't attack the Chiss, and then he attacked the Chiss. And Jada's like, oh, yeah, that we did do that. And that made me want to immediately dig out the Joiner King and see if, like, had Jag said that? 1 minute. Okay, so I guess that was in Joiner King. It was like one sentence. If Lobaka were to return, the Fell family would be responsible for repaying any damages he caused to the Ascendancy. Jag, that was a stupid thing to do. And back on issues where I just felt like there were too many things left hanging. In the epilogue, we learn that the Jedi had used the Fizz to seed all the other worlds in the nebula that the Killiks were on, and it's going to keep their population down so that this won't happen again. Number one, we never saw them do that. Number two, I don't like insects, but is that the right thing to do? It seemed to me like just removing Raynar and Lomi from the equation would maybe return the Killiks back to the way they've been. And to take such a drastic step as that, I was a little surprised by. So, in short, while the Swarm War does conclude the Dark Nest trilogy, there are a lot of loose ends left hanging for the Legacy of the Force series to pick up on and further develop. Raynar is out of commission, Lomi Plo is dead, but Jaina and Zekk are still joiners. Jacen definitely has some stuff going on. Luke has temporarily solved the problem with the Jedi Order, but this is clearly not a long-term solution. And the Jedi Order is still somewhat at odds with the political reality in which they live. If you came out of the new Jedi Order series wishing that there had been more focus on the original trio of Han, Luke, and Leia, then maybe the Darkness trilogy are the books for you, because Han and Leia and Luke are key integral parts of the story here. Maybe even so to the detriment of the younger characters, who, especially in the case of Jaina and some of the younger Jedi Knights, I felt like had a story to tell here, but were frequently pushed to the background to keep the focus on our original heroes. So next time, I'm going to be jumping back to the prequels in the immediate aftermath of Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, with Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader by James Luceno.